The cabin of Flight 902 was quiet, save for the gentle hum of the twin-jet engines cruising at 35,000 feet. It was 3:45 a.m. over the North Atlantic, a time when most passengers were asleep under thin airline blankets, dreaming of their destination in London. In the cockpit, Captain Sarah Jenkins took a sip of lukewarm coffee, her eyes scanning the dashboard with a practiced, rhythmic gaze. To her co-pilot, a young man named Mike, who was fresh out of flight school, Sarah was just a middle-aged woman with graying hair and a motherly smile. She talked about her garden and her 2 golden retrievers. He had no idea that the hands currently resting lightly on the yoke had once flown supersonic sorties through enemy radar nets. Before we begin, tell us in the comments where in the world you're watching. The peace of the night was shattered in a split second. A violent shudder ripped through the aircraft, followed immediately by a deafening bang that sounded like a cannon firing. The cockpit lights flickered and died, plunging them into darkness before the red emergency backup lights bathed their faces in a crimson glow. The plane banked hard to the left, groaning under extreme stress. Mike shouted something incoherent, grabbing the controls. But Sarah's instincts took over faster than thought. Her coffee cup fell to the floor, forgotten, in a heartbeat. The motherly gardener vanished, replaced by someone cold, precise, and terrifyingly calm. "Engine 1 failure," Sarah announced, her voice devoid of fear. "We have a fire warning. Shutting down fuel to Engine 1. Mike, get the checklist." But it was worse than a simple engine failure. As Sarah fought to level the heavy aircraft, the navigation screens went black. The radio let out a high-pitched screech and then fell into static silence. They were flying blind on one engine, in the middle of a dense cloud layer, with no way to talk to air traffic control. Then came the second shock. The radar threat receiver, a piece of equipment usually silent on civilian flights, began to chirp. It wasn't a weather warning. It was a target lock. "Captain," Mike stammered, his eyes wide with terror as he looked out the side window. "Look." Through the breaks in the clouds, 2 dark shapes appeared off their right wing. They were sleek, sharp, and moving with lethal grace. Fighter jets. And they weren't escorting. They were in an attack formation. Sarah realized with a sinking heart that the explosion hadn't just knocked out their engine. It had destroyed their transponder. To the military radar below, Flight 902 was now an unidentified, non-responsive object flying straight toward a classified naval carrier group conducting war games in the sector. "They think we are a missile or a drone," Sarah said, her grip tightening on the yoke. "They're going to shoot us down." The radio crackled, but it wasn't air traffic control. It was a harsh military voice broadcasting on the emergency guard frequency. "Unidentified aircraft. This is United States Navy Flight Lead. You are in restricted airspace. Divert your course immediately to heading 270 or you will be engaged. This is your final warning." Mike was hyperventilating. "We can't divert. If we turn that hard with one engine, we'll stall and drop out of the sky. Tell them we are civilians." Sarah tried the radio. "Mayday, mayday, this is Flight 902. We have civilians on board." Static. The explosion had damaged the outgoing transmitter. They could hear the Navy pilots, but the Navy pilots couldn't hear them. To the fighters, the plane was ignoring orders and pushing deeper into defensive zone. "They're locking on," Mike whispered, watching the fighter jets fan out. One dropped back, positioning itself for a missile shot. Sarah closed her eyes for a fraction of a second. She breathed in. She wasn't Captain Jenkins of the airline anymore. She was back in the cockpit of an F-18 20 years ago. She knew the protocol. She knew exactly what the pilot behind her was thinking, because she used to be him. If she couldn't speak to them with radio, she had to speak to them with the plane. "Hang on," Sarah said. "What are you doing?" Mike yelled. "Communicating," Sarah replied. She disengaged the autopilot completely. With 180 souls on board and only one working engine, Sarah pushed the nose down. The heavy airliner groaned as it picked up speed, diving toward the ocean. "Captain!" Mike screamed. "Quiet!" Sarah snapped. She leveled the plane out at a dangerous low altitude, just above the cloud layer. Then She did something that should have been impossible for a commercial airliner. She banked the plane hard left, then snapped it hard right, and then leveled it again. It wasn't a random wobble. It was a sharp, deliberate wing waggle, a specific, rhythmic motion used by old-school fighter pilots to signal a system's failure when radios were dead. It was an archaic signal, rarely taught anymore, but every veteran knew it. The fighter jet behind them hesitated. The missile lock tone didn't stop, but the shot didn't come. Sarah didn't stop there. She knew the Navy pilot needed to see into the cockpit to confirm they weren't a drone. She reduced speed, bringing the massive jet dangerously close to a stall speed, forcing the fighter jet to slow down alongside her. She reached up and flashed the landing lights in a specific pattern. 3 shorts, 3 longs, 3 shorts. SOS. The fighter jet pulled up alongside the cockpit, just 50 feet away. Sarah looked out the window. She could see the pilot's helmet. She turned on the internal cockpit light, illuminating her face and her uniform. She raised her hand and gave a sharp, crisp salute. For 10 agonizing seconds, nothing happened. The fighter jet held its position. The passengers in the back were screaming, terrified by the sudden dive and the sight of the warplane off the wing. Mike was shaking, clutching his rosary beads. Then, the radio crackled again. The voice was different this time. It wasn't the aggressive warning from before. The tone had changed from hostility to disbelief. Civilian aircraft. The voice said, sounding stunned, "That was a hell of a maneuver. You handle that bus like a fighter. Identify yourself." Sarah grabbed a handset, praying the short-range backup transmitter would work now that the fighter was so close. She didn't use her airline call sign. That hadn't worked. She needed to speak their language. She dug deep into a memory she hadn't touched in decades, a name she had buried when she left the service to raise a family. "Navy Flight Lead," she said, her voice steady as steel. "This is—" She paused. "This is former Lieutenant Colonel Jenkins. Call sign, Sidewinder." There was a long silence on the frequency. It stretched for 5 seconds, then 10. Mike looked at her, confused. He had never heard that name. Sidewinder was a legend, a pilot from the first Gulf conflicts who was famous for saving a damaged squadron during a sandstorm. It was a story told in flight schools, a myth. The radio clicked. "Did you say Sidewinder?" the Navy pilot asked, his voice cracking with emotion. "Affirmative," Sarah replied. "We are crippled. 1 engine out. Comms damaged. Requesting immediate escort to the nearest tarmac. I have 180 civilians behind me. Get us home, kid." "Copy that, Sidewinder," the pilot replied, and this time there was distinct respect in his voice. "I read you loud and clear. My instructor at Top Gun used to talk about you. He said you were the best he ever saw. It is an honor, ma'am. Form up on my wing. We'll clear the path." The 2 fighter jets, moment ago ready to blow Flight 902 out of the sky, now moved into a protective escort formation. They guided Sarah through the heavy storm, using their superior radar to find a gap in the weather. When the lights of the nearest airfield appeared at 5:15 a.m., Sarah's arms were aching from wrestling the heavy, unbalanced plane, but she didn't waver. She brought the massive jet down with a smoothness that defied physics, the tires kissing the runway so gently the passengers barely felt it. As the plane slowed to a stop and emergency vehicles raced out to meet them, the cockpit fell silent. Mike sat frozen in his seat, staring at the woman next to him. He looked at her gray hair, her wrinkles, the coffee stain on her uniform. He tried to reconcile the nice lady who talked about her garden with the pilot who had just outmaneuvered a Navy interceptor. "Sidewinder." Mike whispered, "You're the Sidewinder?" Sarah exhaled a long breath, her shoulders finally slumping as the adrenaline faded. She reached down, picked up her fallen coffee cup, and smiled that same gentle, motherly smile. "That was a long time ago, Mike," she said softly. "Today I'm just Sarah. Now, let's go check on the passengers. I think we're going to be late for breakfast." Outside, the Navy jets did a low flyby, dipping their wings in a final salute to the legend who had returned from the past just long enough to save them all.